In the heart of the great winter, the blizzard they would later call the White Death, two men were cooking dinner. One, named Marcus, huddled close to his hearth, feeding precious splinters of wood into a struggling fire, his face a mask of anxious fury. The wind howled through the chinking of his log walls, stealing the heat almost as fast as the flames could produce it, and the simmering pot of thin broth on the iron hook was a mockery of a meal, barely warm enough to stave off the chill in his family's bones. The other man, Caleb, sat at his table in a different kind of quiet, mending a leather strap by the steady, calm light of a tallow lamp. His cabin was not warm, but it was free of the desperate chill that plagued his neighbor's home, and on his table, a thick, rich stew sat steaming in wooden bowls, its aroma filling the small space with a promise of life and strength. Caleb had not used a stick of firewood to cook that meal in over 8 hours. Before we continue with Caleb's story, a story of quiet genius born from tragedy, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from in the world. And if stories of ingenuity and the simple, world-changing power of a new idea fascinate you, hit that subscribe button. The tale we have for you tomorrow is one you will not want to miss. The idea had not come to Caleb in a flash of inspiration, but had been planted like a bitter seed 2 years earlier on a mild night in late autumn. The tragedy was not his own, but his neighbor Daniel's, and that somehow made it worse. Daniel was a good man, a recent widower left with 2 small children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4. That evening, he had been cooking a rabbit stew, a rare treat. The fire needed feeding, and the woodpile was low. He told his children to stay away from the hearth, a command they had heard 100 times. He was only gone for a moment, just beyond the door where the wood was stacked. It was not the cold that killed them, it was the heat. A log shifted in the grate. A single glowing ember arced through the air, landing silently on a dry bearskin rug. By the time Daniel returned, his arms laden with fresh split oak, the cabin was an inferno. The dry timbers of the frontier home went up like tinder. He dropped the wood and screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony that echoed through the quiet valley. Caleb and the others came running, but it was too late. They could only stand there, helpless, and watch the structure collapse into a roaring pyre, a funeral monument built of fire and smoke. They found what was left of Daniel the next morning, huddled near the scorched foundation, his mind broken by a grief no man could bear. He had survived, but his life was over. In the somber days that followed, the settlement spoke of it as a terrible accident, an act of God, the kind of random, brutal luck that was part of life on the edge of the wilderness. But Caleb saw something else. He saw a system failure. The problem was not the ember. The problem was the constant, ravenous need of the open hearth. To live, to cook, to stay warm, you had to have a fire going for hours every day. And a fire, by its very nature, demanded attention. It was a hungry, dangerous beast squatting in the center of your home. You could never turn your back on it, not for a moment. Daniel's crime was not negligence. It was necessity. He needed wood. He needed to cook. He needed to keep his children warm. The system demanded he do 3 things at once, and in that impossible equation, tragedy was not a risk. It was a mathematical certainty. This realization settled deep in Caleb's soul and would not let him go. He looked at his own hearth with new eyes, not as a source of comfort, but as a ticking clock. Every meal cooked was a gamble. Every moment spent away from the fire while it burned was a roll of the dice. The community saw a tragic accident. Caleb saw a design flaw in their very way of life. They accepted the danger as the price of survival. Caleb began to believe the price was too high and that the design itself was wrong. He became convinced that there had to be a better, safer way to harness the power of fire, a way that did not chain you to its side. The obsession took root and grew, choking out the ordinary concerns of his life. The trapping lines he usually ran with meticulous care were checked with a distracted air. The easy camaraderie at the trading post faded as his mind drifted away from conversations about weather and game, turning inward to the physics of heat and loss. He would sit for an hour, staring at the steam rising from a pot of boiling water, and see not just vapor, but wasted energy, precious heat escaping into the air, doing no work. His neighbors, Marcus chief among them, began to notice his strangeness. They saw him as a man haunted by Daniel's loss, but they mistook the nature of the haunting. He wasn't consumed by grief, he was consumed by a problem. He began a quiet, methodical investigation. He visited other cabins in the settlement and in neighboring valleys, always under the pretense of a friendly call or a small trade. But his eyes were always on their hearths, their cooking methods. He saw the same inefficiency everywhere. He saw women spending their entire day tethered to the fire, stirring, adding wood, banking coals, their attention held hostage by the simmering pot. He saw the constant risk, the near misses with children and flammable materials, the ever-present layer of smoke that filled every home. The problem was universal. It was simply the way things were done. His search for a different way took him further afield. He spent a week with the blacksmith, not to have tools made, but to watch the forge. He saw how the smith used the deep bed of coals, how the heat was contained by the brick and clay structure, radiating inward. He noted how long the forge stayed hot after the bellows fell silent. The principle was containment. The heat had nowhere to go, so it stayed where it was needed. He then traveled to the river to watch the ice cutters. In the winter, they harvested huge blocks of ice from the frozen river to be stored for the summer. He saw how they packed the blocks in a deep pit, burying them in a thick layer of sawdust. He asked the foreman why. The man looked at him as if he were a child. "To keep it from melting," he said. "The sawdust keeps the heat out." Caleb nodded slowly. It keeps the heat out. Or, he thought, it could keep the heat in. The final piece of the puzzle came from an old woman named Anya, a refugee from a land far to the east, a place of harsh winters and endless plains. She lived alone at the edge of the settlement, regarded with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Caleb, hearing she possessed strange old-world knowledge, sought her out. He asked her how her people survived the cold. She spoke of yurts and fires of dried dung, but then she mentioned something else. On the long migrations, when fuel was scarce, they would bring their morning stew to a boil, then wrap the heavy iron pot in thick layers of felt and fur, burying it in the center of their wagon. When they stopped for their evening meal, she said, the stew would still be hot, the tough meat rendered tender. She called it the slow fire. That was it, the key. The blacksmith's forge contained the heat with mass. The ice cutter's pit contained the cold with insulation. Anya's people contained the cooking heat with layers of wool. The solution was not to create more heat, but to stop it from escaping. The vast majority of the energy from a cooking fire did not go into the food. It radiated out into the room, up the chimney, and was lost forever. What if he could capture that initial burst of heat from boiling and trap it with the food in a perfectly insulated space? The cooking would continue, slowly, passively, for hours, with no additional fire, no additional fuel, and most importantly, no additional attention. He returned to the settlement with a new sense of purpose, his eyes alight with the fire of an idea fully formed. He went to the trading post, but his shopping list baffled the proprietor. He did not buy traps or lead shot or salted pork. He bought the 2 thickest wool blankets in the store, a large sack of nails, and several empty grain sacks. From the mill, he purchased a wagon load of sawdust, a material most considered waste. His neighbors watched him haul the strange cargo back to his cabin, whispering among themselves. Marcus grunted to his friends. "Looks like Caleb's finally lost his mind. Planning to sleep in a pile of sawdust, is he?" The men chuckled. The work began the next day. Caleb cleared a space on the floor of his small workshop, a shed attached to the side of his cabin. He had an apprentice of sorts, a quiet, lanky boy of 15 named Finn, whose father had died the previous winter, leaving him to fend for himself. Caleb had taken him in, giving him food and shelter in exchange for help with chores. Finn was a watchful boy, speaking little but seeing everything. He watched now as Caleb laid out his plans, drawn with a piece of charcoal on a smooth plank of pine. Caleb was a skilled carpenter, his hands patient and precise. He began by constructing a large, sturdy box from thick pine boards. It was a simple cube, roughly 2.5 feet on each side. He took great care with the joints, ensuring they were tight and square. Finn, following his instructions, planed the boards until they were perfectly smooth. This, Caleb explained, was the outer casing. Its only job was to be strong and hold everything together. Inside this box, he built another, smaller one. This inner box was crafted with even greater care. The space between the walls of the inner box and the outer box was a uniform 6 inches on all sides, bottom, top, and all 4 verticals. This gap, he explained to Finn, was the heart of the entire invention. It was the space where the heat would be trapped. He constructed a lid for the outer box, heavy and solid. Then he built a second, smaller lid, designed to fit snugly into the top of the inner box, like a plug. The technical details were what mattered. Caleb spent an entire day just on the lids. The inner lid had a handle made of rope, so it could be lifted out easily. The outer lid was hinged with thick leather straps and fitted with a wooden latch. He carved a shallow depression into the top of the inner lid. When the hot pot sits inside, he told Finn, the steam will rise and condense on the lid. Some will find its way out. We need to stop it. He showed the boy how he would lay a damp cloth in the depression of the inner lid and another one over the top of it, creating a simple, effective steam seal before the heavy outer lid was closed. Next came the insulation. He took one of the thick wool blankets and, with Finn's help, carefully lined the entire interior of the outer box. They painstakingly tacked it into place, ensuring there were no gaps or thin spots. Then, they began to fill the 6-inch void. They packed the space under the inner box with a dense layer of sawdust. Then they placed the inner box into position and began filling the sides, packing the sawdust down firmly with a wooden stick. They used more wool, dried moss, and even old torn scraps of cloth, creating a dense, multi-layered barrier against heat transfer. The community watched this strange project with growing amusement and contempt. Marcus would often stop by on his way to check his snares, a smirk playing on his lips. "What is it you're building, Caleb?" "A coffin for a very small bear," he'd call out. His friends would laugh. "It's Caleb's Folly," one of them named it, and the name stuck. They saw a man wasting precious autumn days, time that should have been spent hunting or chopping wood for the winter, on building a useless wooden box. They saw foolishness, a mind addled by grief. Caleb heard their words, but he did not respond. His focus was absolute. He and Finn worked from dawn until dusk, their movements economical and precise. They were not just building a box, they were crafting a tool, and every detail had to be perfect. The inner box was lined with thin sheets of tin Caleb had salvaged from old canisters, creating a radiant barrier to reflect heat back toward the pot. He carved 2 hollows into the thick layer of insulation on opposite sides, perfectly shaped to accommodate the handles of his largest cast-iron stew pot, allowing it to nestle deep inside. He explained the principle to Finn in the quiet evenings. "Heat is a living thing, boy," he'd say, pointing to the fire. "It wants to escape. It flies upwards in smoke and steam. It crawls outwards through the iron of the pot and the air in the room. Our job is to build it a prison it cannot escape from." He showed Finn how even the wood of the box itself was a form of insulation, how every layer they added was another bar on the cage, another guard on the door. The genius of it was not in any single component, but in the combination of them all. The structural frame, the air gap, the packed insulation, the reflective lining, the double-lid steam seal. It was a system, a complete and total defense against the escape of energy. They finished it on a crisp afternoon in late October, just as the last of the autumn leaves were falling from the aspens. The air had a sharp bite to it, a promise of the deep cold to come. The box sat in the corner of Caleb's cabin, a plain, unremarkable object of pine and leather. It looked like nothing more than a storage chest, but to Caleb, it was the answer to a question that had haunted him for 2 years. It was a monument not to death, but to its prevention. The next morning, Caleb decided, would be the first test. The forecast was for a cold rain, a perfect day to stay indoors. He rose before dawn and prepared a simple stew of salted pork, onions, and potatoes. He placed the heavy iron pot on a hook over his hearth fire and brought it to a furious rolling boil. He let it bubble for a full 15 minutes, ensuring the iron of the pot and every bit of food within were saturated with as much heat as they could possibly hold. This, he knew, was the critical step. The box did not create heat, it only preserved it. The initial charge of energy had to be absolute. With Finn's help, he carefully lifted the heavy, scalding pot from the fire. Steam billowed from under the lid. Working quickly and deliberately, they carried it to the box. They lowered it into the waiting cavity, the handles fitting perfectly into the pre-carved hollows. Caleb placed a damp cloth over the pot lid, then fitted the inner plug lid into place. He laid another damp cloth on top of that, and then lowered the heavy, hinged outer lid, securing it with the wooden latch. The entire transfer took less than a minute. Then, there was only silence. The box sat in the corner, inert and unassuming. The proof would come hours later. Caleb went about his day. He repaired a snowshoe, sharpened his axes, and showed Finn how to properly oil and store their traps for the winter. He did not go near the hearth again. The fire dwindled to pale gray ashes. The cabin grew cool, but not cold. Outside, the rain began to fall, a steady drumming beat against the roof. 8 hours passed. Marcus, returning wet and cold from his trapline with only a single muskrat to show for it, saw that Caleb's chimney was not smoking. He shook his head in pity. "The fool is so lost in his contraption, he's forgotten to keep his fire lit," he muttered to himself. As dusk fell, Caleb announced it was time. He and Finn approached the box. There was a palpable tension in the small cabin. Caleb lifted the latch and raised the heavy outer lid. He removed the top cloth, which was still slightly damp. He pulled out the inner lid. A dense cloud of white steam erupted from the box with a soft whoosh, billowing up to the ceiling. It carried with it the rich, savory aroma of perfectly cooked stew. Caleb reached in with a thick leather glove and lifted the pot out. He placed it on the table and lifted the lid. The stew inside was not just warm, it was bubbling gently, steam rising from its surface. It was piping hot, as if it had just been taken off a fire. He ladled a portion into a bowl for Finn and one for himself. The potatoes were soft and creamy, the onions had dissolved into the thick broth, and the salted pork, usually tough unless stewed for hours, was so tender it fell apart at the touch of a spoon. The system worked. It had worked perfectly. Finn's eyes were wide with a quiet, profound amazement. Caleb felt a slow, deep wave of satisfaction wash over him, a feeling of rightness that settled the restless energy that had driven him for 2 years. He had built his prison for heat, and it had held its captive. Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Marcus, stopping by on his way home. He saw the bowls of steaming stew on the table. "Ah, so you finally gave up on your foolish box and lit a fire," he said, a note of smug satisfaction in his voice. He gestured toward the cold, dark hearth. "Though you were slow about it, your chimney's been dead all day." "The fire was lit this morning, Marcus," Caleb said calmly. "Just for a few minutes." He nodded toward the box. The box did the rest. Marcus stared from the hot stew to the strange wooden chest, then to the cold ashes in the fireplace. His face clouded with confusion, then disbelief. "That's impossible," he stated flatly. "You're playing a trick." He walked over to the pot and cautiously held his hand over it, feeling the waves of heat rising from it. He shook his head. "It must be luck. A warm day." "It was raining and cold all afternoon," Caleb replied, his voice even. "It's not luck, Marcus, it's physics." But Marcus would not be convinced. He saw a single successful result as a fluke, a curiosity. "You wasted weeks of good labor and a pile of perfectly good wood to build a box that does slowly what a fire does quickly," he scoffed, his skepticism hardening into disdain. "You've saved a few sticks of wood, perhaps, but at what cost? You've proven nothing but your own eccentricity. A lazy man's stove for a lazy man's work." He turned and left, shaking his head, leaving Caleb and Finn to their quiet, revolutionary meal. The vindication was real, but for now, it was a victory for an army of one. Winter arrived not with a gentle drift of snow, but with a roar. It came in the middle of the night, a howling gale from the north that drove a solid wall of white before it. By dawn, the world had vanished. There was no sky, no ground, no trees, only a churning, blinding chaos of wind and snow. The old-timers had spoken of storms like this, storms that could last for a week, storms that buried cabins to their rooftops and froze livestock solid in the fields. They called it the White Death, and it had come again. The first day was a novelty. The families of the settlement stayed indoors, secure in their homes, confident in their stores of firewood and salted meat. The second day, the wind grew stronger, its voice a constant, shrieking moan that seemed to get inside the very walls of the cabins, inside the very bones of the people. The snow piled up in monumental drifts, burying fences and outbuildings. The third day, the anxiety began. The short, brutal trip to the woodpile became a life-threatening expedition. The wind drove the snow with the force of a sandstorm, stinging any exposed skin and stealing the breath from your lungs. Inside the cabins, a desperate battle was being fought. The battle for heat. The furious wind sucked the warmth out through every crack and seam. Fires had to be kept roaring day and night, not just for cooking, but for survival. The woodpiles, which had seemed so large and reassuring just days before, were dwindling at an alarming rate. The men were forced to make the perilous journey outside again and again, returning covered in ice, their beards frozen solid, their lungs aching from the cold. The constant gnawing need of the fire consumed all their energy, all their attention. In Caleb's cabin, there was a different rhythm. On the first morning of the storm, he had boiled a large pot of oats for breakfast. He'd reheated the leftover stew from the night before, bringing it to a second boil. He placed both pots, a large one and a smaller one, into his cooking box, stuffing a few extra rags into the gaps to ensure a tight fit. He latched the lid. For the rest of the day, and the next, and the one after that, his hearth remained cold. His firewood consumption was a tiny fraction of his neighbor's. His cabin was cool, but the box in the corner was a reservoir of heat and life. Each mealtime he would open it, and they would eat hot food. The oats in the morning, the stew at night. The food, kept at a high temperature for so long, was perfectly preserved and safe to eat. While Marcus and the other men were locked in an exhausting cycle of chopping wood, hauling it inside, and feeding the insatiable fire, Caleb was free. He spent his time methodically checking the integrity of his cabin. He hammered wooden wedges into the gaps around the doorframe to stop the drafts. He climbed into his small attic and cleared the snow that was forcing its way through the roof shingles, preventing a collapse. He had the time, the energy, and most importantly, the mental clarity to focus on the real threats of the storm, because he was not a slave to his fire. His simple box had bought him the most precious resource in a crisis: attention. On the fifth day, the storm reached its zenith. The wind was a physical force, shaking the cabins to their foundations. A cry for help went up from the home of a young family, the Millers. A massive drift had collapsed against their northern wall, and the sheer weight of the snow had cracked one of the main support logs. Their home was in danger of being crushed. The men of the settlement, exhausted and half-frozen, tried to organize a rescue. They struggled through the waist-deep snow, their efforts feeble against the power of the blizzard. It was Caleb who led the effort. He was not tired. He was not preoccupied with his own fire. He emerged from his cabin, his belly full of hot stew, his mind clear. He organized the men, showing them how to use the long roof rakes as probes to find the broken log. He directed them, his voice calm and steady in the shrieking wind, and with a collective, desperate effort, they managed to brace the wall from the inside, saving the Miller family from being buried alive. The men looked at Caleb with a new respect. He seemed stronger, more resilient than the rest of them. They mistook his preparedness for innate toughness, not realizing its true source. The real crisis came on the seventh day. A terrible, despairing silence fell over Marcus's cabin. His wood was gone. He had burned through his entire winter supply in a single week. His last few logs had been turned to ash. The fire was out. The cold inside the cabin was now as brutal as the cold outside. His wife and two small children were huddled together under a pile of blankets, their breath misting in the air. The thin, uncooked strips of salted pork they had to eat were doing little to warm them. They were freezing to death, slowly and inexorably. It was Finn who noticed the chimney first. "Caleb," he said, his voice quiet. "Marcus's chimney. There's no smoke." Caleb looked out his small window. The plume of smoke, which had been a constant, desperate flag against the white storm, was gone. He knew instantly what it meant. He looked at the large pot of bean soup he had prepared that morning, which was now sitting in his cooking box, radiating a silent, invisible warmth. He knew what he had to do. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned. He took the pot of soup from the box, wrapping it in a thick blanket to protect it on the journey. The pot was still so hot it was painful to hold even through his thick gloves. He handed a shovel to Finn. "Stay here. Keep the door clear. I'll be back." He stepped out into the raging heart of the White Death. The journey to Marcus's cabin, normally a walk of less than a minute, was a monumental struggle. The snow was a thick, clinging morass, and the wind was a solid wall that threatened to knock him off his feet. But the warmth of the pot pressed against his chest was a beacon, a portable hearth that gave him strength. He finally reached the door and hammered on it with his fist. After a long moment, the latch scraped open. Marcus stood there, a ghost of a man, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with despair. He stared at Caleb, then at the blanket-wrapped object in his arms, too defeated to even speak. Caleb pushed past him into the freezing cabin. He saw Marcus's wife and children, their faces pale and bluish in the gloom, their shivering so violent it seemed it would shake them apart. Without a word, Caleb placed the pot on the cold hearthstone. He unwrapped the blanket and lifted the lid. A magnificent cloud of steam billowed out, filling the frigid air with the life-giving scent of hot food. The family stared at it as if it were a miracle. Caleb ladled the thick, hot soup into the bowls Marcus's wife held out with trembling hands. They drank it down, the warmth spreading through their bodies, chasing away the cold that had nearly claimed them. It was more than just food, it was life. It was a reversal of the verdict the storm had handed down. Marcus watched, his face a mixture of shame, gratitude, and profound dawning comprehension. He looked at Caleb, who was not even breathing heavily from his ordeal. He looked at the pot of soup, which had been cooked with no fire. He looked at his own cold, dead hearth and his useless, empty wood box. In that moment, he finally understood. Caleb's folly was not folly at all. It was not about saving wood or being lazy. It was about survival. It was about redirecting a man's precious, limited energy from the endless, repetitive task of feeding a fire to the essential work of living. Caleb's box had not just cooked a meal, it had defeated the storm. The vindication was absolute, silent, and complete, delivered not in words, but in a bowl of hot soup in the middle of a frozen hell. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the world that emerged was silent, white, and transformed. The settlement had survived, but it was a close-run thing. As the men began the long work of digging themselves out, a new kind of quiet settled over them. The near-death experience had stripped away the petty certainties of their lives. That afternoon, there was a knock on Caleb's door. It was Marcus. His face was etched with humility, his usual arrogance completely gone. He did not look Caleb in the eye. "Caleb," he said, his voice low, "will you teach me? Will you show me how to build one of those boxes?" Caleb simply nodded. "Come in," he said. He did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you so." The shared ordeal had made such things meaningless. He saw a neighbor in need, and he saw a chance to prevent the next tragedy, just as he had always wanted. He pulled out the charcoal-drawn plans and began to explain the principles of his invention, sharing the knowledge freely, holding nothing back. He knew the idea was more important than the credit. Its purpose was to keep people safe, and it could only do that if it was shared. Soon, Marcus was not the only one. The Millers came, and then others. The story of how Caleb had walked through the heart of the storm with a pot of hot soup, and how his cabin had been a bastion of readiness while others were fighting for their lives, had spread through the exhausted community. One by one, they came to his workshop, hats in hand, to ask for his help. Caleb and Finn spent the next several weeks teaching, demonstrating, and helping their neighbors build their own cooking boxes. The settlement was soon filled with the sounds of saws and hammers, but this time it was a sound of communal purpose, not of individual mockery. The boxes began to appear in every cabin. They were not all identical to Caleb's original. Some used packed straw for insulation. Others used dried cattail fluff. Some were round to fit a specific pot. Others were long and rectangular to hold baking stones. The core principle, however, remained the same. The idea had taken root, adapting itself to the materials and needs of each family. Caleb watched the variations multiply, pleased to see the idea become not just his, but theirs. Months later, a traveling trader named Silas made his way to the settlement, his wagon laden with goods from the east. He was a shrewd observer of men and their ways, always looking for a new product or a new idea to trade. He noticed the strange wooden boxes that sat in the corner of nearly every cabin he visited. He saw a woman bring a pot to a boil at breakfast, place it in the box, and then head out to her garden, free for the day. He was astonished by the simple genius of it. He sought out Caleb, who was pointed out to him as the man who had first built one. Silas offered to buy the rights to the design, to pay Caleb for his invention. Caleb refused. "The idea is free," Caleb told him. "Take it, share it, just tell people how it works." Silas, a man who understood the value of everything, was baffled by something given away for nothing. But he recognized the power of the innovation. He carefully drew his own set of plans, documenting the construction and the principles as Caleb explained them. When he left the valley, he took the idea with him. In the years that followed, the innovation spread across the frontier. Settlers arriving in new territories were often taught how to build a haybox, so named for the most common insulating material. It appeared in pamphlets and guides for pioneers, presented as a piece of common-sense folk wisdom. It was called a settler's oven in one region, a fireless cooker in another. The idea became ubiquitous, a standard piece of equipment for any family living far from civilization. But its origin, the story of Daniel's tragic fire and a quiet man's obsessive quest, was lost. The name Caleb was never attached to it. The idea had become anonymous, a part of the shared knowledge of the people, which was, perhaps, the most fitting tribute of all. Decades passed. The settlement grew into a town. The raw frontier receded, replaced by fenced fields and graded roads. Caleb grew old. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He was known as a competent farmer and a good neighbor, a man who was always steady in a crisis. The children who grew up in the town used the cooking boxes in their homes as a matter of course, as natural and unquestioned as a door or a window. They had no idea that the quiet old man they saw in the market was the reason their mothers were not tethered to the hearth all day, the reason their homes were safer. Caleb died peacefully in his sleep in the same cabin he had built with his own hands so many years before. The cooking box, scarred and stained from a lifetime of use, still sat in the corner. His gravestone was simple, carved from local stone. It read only, Caleb, husband, father, farmer. There was no mention of his invention, no hint of the quiet revolution he had started. His legacy was not written in stone, but was lived every day in the warmth and safety of countless homes. His contribution was unmeasurable, written in the negative space of history. It was counted in the number of children who were not burned, the cabins that did not catch fire, the women who had hours of their lives given back to them, the families who survived winters they otherwise might not have. It was a legacy of prevented tragedies, of silent, daily efficiencies that compounded over generations, making life just a little bit safer, a little bit easier on the hard edge of the world. Long after the town had grown and the memory of the first settlers had faded into legend, a family clearing out an old, abandoned homestead at the edge of the valley found a strange, heavy box in the corner of the dilapidated cabin. They opened it, revealing the tin lining and the dusty, packed insulation within. They did not know what it was for. They saw it only as a curious relic from a bygone era, a piece of old junk. But on a cold winter night, miles away in the warm, bright kitchens of the town that now stood there, dozens of families would sit down to a hot meal that had cooked itself safely all day, completely unaware that their comfort and their safety were born from the grief, the genius, and the quiet persistence of the forgotten man who had first built that strange and wonderful box.